So once again, low pressure, we assume wet precipitation, high pressure, dry, no precipitation. So in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, where is it located in terms of these world pressure belts? It's located right here in the middle. And so in Africa, because it's pretty much straddles the equator, we have the equatorial low pressure, the ITCZ, the extreme dense rain belt that goes right through the middle of Sub-Saharan Africa. But to the north, we have a subtropical high pressure, which explains why it's so dry up there, the Sahara Desert. But to the south, we have another subtropical high pressure, the Kalahari Desert, which explains why it's so dry there. And so here you have January and July mapped. So January on the left, July on the right. The yellow dashed line is the equator. So we can see in both of these maps, we can see changes in terms of where we find precipitation. Of course, this is going to be very clearly related to the location of that equatorial low pressure that moves up and down throughout the year. In January, it moves down, which explains why south of the equator, we see that dense purple, that rain area. And then in July, everything shifts. And then there in south of the equator, it's now suddenly dry. Whereas in July, they get their rainy period. And now looking at temperature, when we think about Africa in terms of its climate, Sub-Saharan Africa especially, its climate is pretty much hot everywhere. There are some exceptions, as we can see, as you get a little farther away from the equator, particularly there in July. You can see how Southern Africa gets a little bit cooler. You do see a little bit more seasonality down there. But for the most part, it's summer year-round throughout much of Sub-Saharan Africa. You get up to Northern Africa, of course, you see big changes there. But you see Sub-Saharan Africa, mostly it's yellow. Once again, we can see some topography, the role of some higher elevation creating cooler temperatures. You can see that in both the January and the July. You can, once again, you can see the Ethiopian highlands. Also in the Great Rift Valley, you can see, for example, Mount Kilimanjaro. You can see some of the other rugged features along those Great Lakes. So here's our climate map of Sub-Saharan Africa zoomed in a little bit. And of course, these are going to be hot and dry places in which temperatures are actually highest here in desert areas than anywhere else you're going to find on the continent. And so even though you would think, well, near the equator would be where it's hottest, actually it's the desert areas. And it goes along with the idea that they get very, very powerful sun rays, just like the equator, but they have no clouds. And so the sun just comes screaming through the atmosphere and really heats up the surface. So in the desert areas, both there in the African transition zone and or the Sahel, but also in the Horn of Africa, there just precipitation is it's just absent. It's very rarely there. And so subsequently, not much vegetation. So subsequently, hardly any people there. So the groups that do live here are very nomadic. They're very much on the move. But there's not much here agriculturally. Next up is the semi-arid steppe. And so as we saw in Northern America, it's kind of a steppe, kind of a transition from very, very arid areas to areas of more moisture. And so semi-arid steppe, we kind of see this thin belt that also very much goes right there along the African transition zone, but also the Sahel. So the semi-arid steppe, it's going to become very, very important when we look at some conflicts. You got some people who are kind of more hunters and gatherers. We call them pastoralists, kind of on the move. But we also have farmers. And so you have people who settle in one spot versus people who kind of are on the move. So that can kind of be the recipe for some conflict. But this is also an area where we see desertification. And what we're seeing is the conversion of kind of some grassland, some semi-arid steppe of vegetation to this essentially desert. And a little bit more, we look at the vegetation. We're starting to see a little bit more trees in the semi-arid steppe, but still very, very dry, very much desert-like conditions, but they get a little bit of precipitation, especially during that one period of the year when the rainfall comes up and essentially the intertropical convergence zone comes up enough to give this area a little bit of moisture, which is all it needs. Further, one of the things you find in this area is it's very much drought, but also a lot of fires in this particular area. You just think if you just get this dry wood, let's say a lightning strike just happens, or something really hot temperatures can over time kind of spark a fire in which over time it can clear the low-lying areas. So some of the trees have actually adapted to being able to resist fires. It's kind of how they've been able to survive. over time. These fires have been happening naturally, but also because of humans. Savannas, and so this is going to be the grassland areas. This is going to be the area of Africa that a lot of people think about. They think about the people, going on safari trips, watching lions. You might be seeing TV, National Geographic Channel, in which you have people, going around looking at elephants and giraffes and all of that. Well, that's the savanna, essentially. So the tropical savanna is this grassland in which it does have a long dry period, but it does also have a wet period. And so once again, this relates to the intertropical convergence zone. So we have a tropical savanna so I have a wet season in which the ITCZ kind of moves up, but then it'll have a dry season as the ITCZ, as that equatorial low pressure trough, that area of dense rain, then moves to the south. And so here we can see, enough vegetation. We see trees, we see leaves. All of that requires enough precipitation, enough moisture. We also see clouds in the sky. So all of this kind of is very much characteristic of the savanna, but really a transition from the steppe to the savanna. In the following images, I'll show you how the savanna is a very, very large area, very vast, very diverse. And so it kind of has these blends from maybe being a little bit drier, maybe more semi-arid steppe-like, to now areas with a little bit taller grassland, a little bit more vegetation on the surface, and even in some parts where it's very marshy. And so the tropical savanna, very, very vast, covers a good amount of sub-Saharan Africa, but it also is quite diverse in terms of the grasses and types of vegetation you'd find. A particular region covers a vast area, the tropical dry forest. You can see it in parts, that's that kind of that blue, it's in between the dark blue, we see it underneath the equator and a little bit darker than the savanna we just came from, is the tropical dry forest. And so we see it in parts there, West Africa. We see it, of course, on both sides of the tropical rainforest, but we can also see the tropical dry forest over in Madagascar. Tropical dry forest, as the name implies, it has a dry season. So we actually find in parts deciduous trees in this particular forest. Now, it's not the types of deciduous trees we'd find in Indiana, the trees that lose their leaves in fall and all, autumn and all of that, the colors and all of that. But in the tropical dry forest, we do see some deciduous trees, and it all relates, but the movement of the ITCZ. And so when the ITCZ moves up, then the northern part this north of the equator, that tropical dry forest has its rainy period. But then when the ITCZ moves to the other tropical dry forest to the south of the equator, then the one in the north, that's when they get their dry season, their dry period. And so it's back and forth. And so essentially another way to think about it is places north of the equator, the tropical dry forest, have their wet season. And then at the same time, during the same season, then on the other side of the equator, they must be having their dry season and vice versa. Now we have the tropical wet or rainforest, and so as the name implies, wet means it's essentially getting year-round rain. So the ITCZ is always pretty much somewhere nearby. So here we have dense rain, and so we're going to also see dense forests. Here the trees, you don't see much as far as variation from one area to the other. In terms of where you see variation are in terms of the canopy. And so you see trees that grow really tall. So those obviously are extremely big. And so they typically have real, leafy tops in which most of the branches and most of the, parts of the tree that we know of besides the trunk are way up high. Then you have other ones that kind of hang out in the middle canopy, kind of evolve to get a little bit of sun. And then you have some at the bottom, who get hardly any sun because of all the dense, vegetation above it. And here we can see from the Congo River, which is in equatorial Africa, the tropical rainforest. Now, on the other side of the equator, on the other side of the tropical rainforest, in the southern part of the tropical dry forest, we have the now southern side of the savanna, which is where the Serengeti is. Serengeti is becoming a very big tourist attraction in which people are going there to want to see, the grasslands. You see these particular types of trees in which they've over time been able to adapt to being in a very, very, very dry area. And of course, we have the semi-arid steppe and then the desert on the other side, and the semi-arid steppe and the desert. I've already mentioned, but Kalahari Desert is located here in southern Africa. And so it's underneath the Tropic of Capricorn. So it's underneath that dry area, that dry belt that persists across the world. And then finally, the southern tip of Africa, we actually have a climate similar to our own, a sea climate, in which, it looks a whole lot like the United States, in which we've got crappy landscaping too.